What is the G8?
It is the Group of Eight, an annual meeting of the world's leading industrial democracies. Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. It began as the Group of Six, with the 1975 conference in France, where representatives of 6 nations, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States, met to discuss international economic and political issues. The goal of the meeting was to shore up cooperation on matters of concern to the member nations. Canada joined the group in 1976 and Russia in 1994, though the nation did not participate fully in the sessions until 1998. Hosting responsibilities rotate among the 8 member countries. In 2004, the United States hosted the 30th meeting, on an island off the coast of Georgia. Among the agenda items were the training of international peacekeepers, setting up a global initiative to develop a human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, vaccine, and developing a plan to end famine in the Horn of Africa. Easternmost Africa, including Somalia, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. By 2009, the leaders and representatives of non-G8 countries were invited to participate in discussions relevant to them.
How did Charles Darwin develop his theory of evolution?
The English naturalist Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, was attending Cambridge when, through a friend, he gained appointment as naturalist aboard the HMS Beagle. The around-the-world voyage began in 1831, and Darwin was able to gather data on flora, fauna, and geology in the world's southern lands, the South American coasts, the Galapagos, the Andes Mountains, Australia, and Asia. The trip lasted into 1836, and in the years that followed Darwin published and edited many works on natural history, though none of them put forth his theory of evolution. It's interesting to note that Darwin's paternal grandfather, Erasmus Darwin (1731–1802), was a physician, botanist, and poet, who in 1803 wrote verse that he titled, "The Temple of Nature, or the Origin of Society," which anticipated the theory of evolution that his grandson would put forth. Encouraged by Sir Charles Lyell, 1797–1875, who is considered the father of modern geology, Charles Darwin wrote out his theory. Coincidentally, he received the abstract of an identical theory of natural selection, formulated by English naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, 1823–1913, who had arrived at his conclusions independently of Darwin. Wallace had made his formulation of evolution based on his study of comparative biology in Brazil's Amazon River and the East Indies, Malay Archipelago. In 1858, Darwin published both his work as well as the abstract written by Wallace. The following year he backed up his theory in On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. which was found to be scientifically credible. It was widely read by the public, which snatched up so many copies that the first printing of the first edition sold out in only one day. Darwin added to this work with The Descent of Man in 1871. What Darwin put forth was that all life originated with a simple primordial protoplasm, the fundamental material of which all living things are composed. In his theory of natural selection, Darwin posited that those species that are best adapted to the environment are the species that survive and reproduce. While organic evolution and natural selection had a profound impact on the world of science, which further studied and supported the concepts, they jarred much of the religious community and created a controversy. Creationists, who believe the origin story put forth in the Bible, the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, objected to Darwin's theories. Debate between evolution and creationism ensued, most notably in the so-called Scopes monkey trial of July 1925, Dayton, Tennessee. Public school teacher John T. Scopes, 1900 to 1970, was charged with violating a state law that prohibited the teaching of evolution. He was defended by one of the most acclaimed attorneys of all time, Clarence Darrow, 1857 to 1938. But the prosecution was led by another prominent lawyer, William Jennings Bryan, 1860 to 1925, and Scopes lost the case. But Scopes was later released on a technicality. The law was eventually repealed, in 1967. Though scientific research has largely substantiated the theory of evolution described by Charles Darwin, the theory of creation still has its followers, mostly religious fundamentalists.
How old is the game of billiards?
The Italians were the first to play this table game, in the 1550s. It's different than pool, since billiards requires the players to cause the cue ball to hit two object balls in succession. There are no pockets, as there are in pool.
What was the Bay of Pigs?
Bay of Pigs is the name of an unsuccessful 1961 invasion of Cuba, which was backed by the U.S. government. About 1,500 Cuban expatriates living in the United States had been supplied with arms and trained by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. On April 17, 1961, the group of men who opposed the regime of Cuba's Fidel Castro, 1926, landed at the Bahia de Coquinos, Bay of Pigs, in west-central Cuba. Most of the rebels were captured by the Cuban forces, others were killed. In order to secure the release of the more than 1,100 men who had been captured during the invasion, private donors in the United States accumulated $53 million in food and medicine, which was given to Castro's government in exchange for the rebels' release. The failed invasion came as a terrible embarrassment to the Kennedy administration. And many believe the Bay of Pigs incident directly led to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
What was the controversy with Thomas Becket?
Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas Becket, c. 1118 to 1170, was killed by knights in the service of England's King Henry II. 1133 to 1189, he had refused to be subservient to the monarch. In the long struggle between church and state, the story of St. Thomas Becket is a dramatic chapter. Born in London in about 1118, when he was in his 20s, Becket entered into service for the Archbishop of Canterbury, the spiritual head of the Church of England. He subsequently held various church offices, including archdeacon. When Henry II was coronated in 1154, becoming the worldly leader of the Church of England, he found in Becket one of his most vigorous champions. In 1162 Henry made him Archbishop of Canterbury. But a transformation soon occurred in Thomas Becket, who put his spiritual duties first and began defending the church against the king's power. Henry, eager to increase royal authority, was determined to regain control over the church. A bitter struggle ensued between the two former friends. At one point, Becket fled the country because he was in fear for his life. When he returned to England 6 years later, in 1170, he renewed his opposition to the king, but nevertheless forced a reconciliation with him. Henry was still irked by Becket's open defiance to his authority, and he suggested to his knights that one among them might be brave enough to do away with him, ending the king's troubles. 4 knights took the king at his word, and on December 29, 1170, they found Becket in Canterbury Cathedral and killed him as he made his evening prayers. Henry later did penance for the crime. Becket was canonized 3 years later.
What are Islam's 5 pillars of faith?
Muslims practice adherence to the 5 pillars of faith. 1. Belief in Allah as the only God and Muhammad as his prophet. 2. Prayer 5 times daily at dawn, at noon, in the afternoon, in the evening, and at nightfall. 3. Giving alms to the poor. 4. Fasting from dawn until dusk during the holy month of Ramadan. And 5. Making the pilgrimage, Hajj, to the holy city of Mecca at least once during their lifetime.
What was the 30 Years' War?
The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 48, like the 100 Years' War, was actually a series of related conflicts, rather than one long campaign. The conflict in Europe began as a religious one, with hostility between Roman Catholics and Protestants. but it eventually turned political before it was ended with the Peace of Westphalia. The war had four periods: the Bohemian, 1618–24, the Danish, 1625–29, the Swedish, 1630–34, and the Swedish-French, 1635–48. In Bohemia, part of present-day Czech Republic. The trouble began in the capital of Prague when the Archbishop authorized the destruction of a Protestant church. The act angered Bohemian Protestants and those elsewhere in Europe who believed it was their right granted by the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, to worship as Lutherans. When Holy Roman Emperor Matthias, 1557–1619, failed to intervene on behalf of the Protestants, Prague became the scene of mayhem in May 1618.
Which British monarch has ruled the longest?
Victoria, 1819–1901, claims the distinction of having remained on the throne of England the longest. She became queen in June 1837 upon the death of her uncle, King William IV, 1765–1837. Since she was but a teenager at the time, during the early years of her reign she relied on the guidance of the Prime Minister. The tactful Lord Melbourne, William Lamb, 1779–1848, whom she counted as a friend. After marrying Prince Albert, 1819–1861, in 1840, she also sought out advice from him and his advisor. But by 1850 she had grown confident in her abilities, and she managed the country's affairs with authority. Later in her reign, Prime Ministers Benjamin Disraeli, 1804–1881, and William Gladstone, 1809–1898, gradually secured increased authority for that office without alienating the Queen. It is for this reason that she is often seen as the first modern monarch, of which she remains a lasting symbol. Queen Victoria celebrated her Diamond Jubilee in 1897 amidst an outpouring of public support. She remained on the throne for more years, until her death in 1901. During her 64-year reign, Queen Victoria presided over the rise of industrialization in Great Britain as well as British imperialism abroad. Architecture, art, and literature flourished, in part due to the influence and interests of Prince Albert. It was the prince who in 1851 sponsored the forward-looking Great Exhibition at London's Crystal Palace. It was the first international exposition, a World Fair. The Grand Crystal Palace remained a symbol of the Victorian age until it was destroyed by fire in 1936.
What is Marxism?
Marxism is an economic and political theory named for its originator, Karl Marx, 1818–1883. Marx was a German social philosopher and revolutionary who in 1844 in Paris met another German philosopher, Friedrich Engels, 1820–1895, beginning a long collaboration. 4 years later they wrote the Communist Manifesto, laying the foundation for socialism and communism. The cornerstone of Marxism, to which Engels greatly contributed, is the belief that history is determined by economics. Based on this premise, Marx asserted that economic crises will result in increased poverty, which in turn will inspire the working class, proletariat, to revolt, ousting the capitalists, bourgeoisie. According to Marx, once the working class has seized control, it will institute a system of economic cooperation and a classless society. In his most influential work, Das Kapital, The Capital, an exhaustive analysis of capitalism published in 3 volumes, 1867, 1885, and 1894, Marx predicted the failure of the capitalist system. Based on his belief that the history of society is the history of class struggle, he and Engels viewed an international revolution as inevitable. While Marxism still has followers in the late 20th century, most scholars have discredited Marx's predictions, citing improved conditions for workers in industrialized nations, which has been brought about by the evolution of capitalism.
What was the worst hurricane in U.S. history?
Hurricane Katrina, which hit the Gulf Coast in late August 2005, was not only the most disastrous hurricane in U.S. history, it was the nation's worst single weather disaster. Though not the strongest possible hurricane when it made landfall, Katrina had weakened from a Category 5 storm to a Category 4 storm just before it struck the Gulf Coast. Katrina was a monster. The storm stretched about 200 miles in diameter, packed winds up to 145 miles per hour, produced torrential rain and huge waves, spawned twisters throughout the region, and pushed up a 28-foot storm surge, a surge usually found only in Category 5 hurricanes. Katrina moved ashore on the Gulf Coast on Monday, August 29. In anticipation of the hurricane, New Orleans, which sits below sea level, had been evacuated. But there were still tens of thousands who stayed out of necessity, such as law enforcement and healthcare workers. Because they were unable to evacuate, or because they chose not to leave, some 23,000 of those who stayed holed up in the aging Superdome Sports Arena, which was set up as an emergency shelter. The structure barely withstood the lashing winds of Katrina, which blew off portions of the dome. On Tuesday morning, after Katrina ravaged Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, before weakening as it moved inland, officials and news reporters generally agreed that there was unbelievable damage all along the coast. But New Orleans had dodged a bullet. The Big Easy had not taken the worst of it. Gulfport and Biloxi, Mississippi, appeared the hardest hit. The devastation there was astonishing. As reports of damage began to be made, it became clear that about 90% of the structures along the Gulf Coast were destroyed and hundreds of thousands of people were displaced by Katrina. The death toll was not known, and officials conceded it would take time to determine. The storm had been so ruinous of biblical proportions. Some said that rescue and recovery would take weeks and months. Later, when the full extent of damage began to be discovered, the recovery estimates were revised to years. Later Tuesday, New Orleans' fate changed. Levees that protect the city could not hold back a swollen Lake Pontchartrain. 80% of the city filled with water, 25 feet deep. Officials and volunteers could not get flood victims out fast enough, usually plucking them from rooftops or finding them in attics, where survivors sought refuge as waters rose. The city descended into chaos and lawlessness. Heart-wrenching images of human despair filled the media, touching people around the nation. Americans responded with donations of money, goods, and time. The American Red Cross launched the largest mobilization effort in its history. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, a part of the Department of Homeland Security (DHS). The Coast Guard, also part of the DHS, and the U.S. military struggled to keep pace with Katrina's aftermath all along the coast. For all the effort, it was widely acknowledged that the government's response to the disaster was inadequate and late. On Friday, September 2, President George W. Bush said that the results had been unacceptable. He further promised to make it right. While politicians and the people spoke out on the subject, some experts said the catastrophe had simply overwhelmed the system. Emergency programs across the nation had been set up to rely on local and state response first, backed by the federal government. In Katrina's case, the devastation was so great that the localities and states either were not able to respond at all or could not respond with enough help. Federal intervention had been needed sooner and in greater measure to alleviate human suffering and protect lives. Government officials all seemed of one accord. However, the fact-finding could wait, the victims could not. Cities and states across the nation sent resources to the Gulf Coast and set up emergency centers to receive storm refugees, whose needs were immediate: water, food, clothing, shelter, medicine, healthcare, and counseling, and long-term, jobs, schools, and permanent housing. On Wednesday, September 7, 9 days after Katrina struck, the situation continued to unfold. The size and scope of the tragedy remained to be fully understood. New Orleans ordered a forced evacuation of the holdouts. The city remained flooded with toxic floodwaters as repairs were made in the levees and the hazardous water began to be pumped out. Efforts to reunite families, separated in the chaos, were ongoing. For many days, rescue workers all along the Gulf Coast had moved from house to house to find survivors. Now it was a matter of trying to identify and count the dead. The death toll was expected to be in the thousands. The affected area was 90,000 square miles, or about the size of Minnesota. Property damage was projected to be at least $26 billion in insured losses and perhaps twice that amount in uninsured losses. Katrina had also caused damages as it struck Florida as a Category 1 hurricane on August 26. It later moved into the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico and strengthened before striking the Gulf Coast. Katrina's aftermath was felt in every state of the Union. Volunteers shored up efforts to assist survivors who were being relocated in an effort to ease the burden on the afflicted region. Schools across the nation opened doors to displaced students. Fuel prices skyrocketed and natural gas and heating oil prices promised to follow, as offshore rigs and Gulf Coast refineries suffered. And most Americans worried about the government's response to the catastrophe. The disaster made an impact around the world as well, with some 95 countries offering assistance. Before Katrina, the deadliest hurricane to strike the United States was an unnamed Category 4 storm that struck Galveston, Texas, in 1900. The September 8 storm claimed at least 8,000 lives. Some estimates place the number as high as 12,000. Hurricane strength is measured on the Saffir-Simpson scale, where Category 1 is the weakest. With sustained winds of at least 74 miles per hour and a storm surge of 4 to 5 feet above normal, and Category 5 is the strongest. With sustained winds of more than 155 miles per hour and a storm surge higher than 18 feet. The United States has been hit by 3 Category 5 storms since record-keeping began. The first was a Labor Day hurricane, which struck the Florida Keys in 1935, 408 people died. The second was Camille, which hit Mississippi and southeast Louisiana in 1969, claiming 256 lives. Hurricane Andrew, which struck South Miami-Dade County, Florida. In late August 1992, was measured as a Category 4 storm at the time, but the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency (NOAA) reclassified it in 2002 as a Category 5 storm. Andrew claimed more than 100 lives and devastated a wide area, mostly around the town of Homestead, Florida.
What was the Bolshevik Revolution?
It was the November 1917 revolution in which the Bolsheviks, an extremist faction within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, later renamed the Russian Communist Party, seized control of the government, ushering in the Soviet age. The event is also known as the October Revolution since by the Old Russian calendar, in use until 1918. The government takeover happened on October 25. The Bolshevik Revolution was the culmination of a series of events in 1917. In March, with Russia still in the midst of World War I, 1914-18, the country faced hardship. Shortages of food and fuel made conditions miserable. The people had lost faith in the war effort and were loath to support it by sending any more young men into battle. In the Russian capital of Petrograd, which had been known as St. Petersburg until 1914, workers went on strike and rioting broke out. In the chaos, called the March Revolution, Tsar Nicholas II, 1868–1918, ordered the legislative body, the Duma, to disband. Instead, the representatives set up a provisional government. Having lost all political influence, Nicholas abdicated the throne on March 15. He and his family were imprisoned and are believed to have been killed in July of the following year. Hearing of Nicholas's abdication, longtime political exile Vladimir Lenin, 1870–1924, returned from Europe to Petrograd, where he led the Bolsheviks in rallying the Russian people with calls for peace, land reform, and worker empowerment. Their slogan was land, peace, and bread. The Bolsheviks grew in numbers and became increasingly radical, in spite of efforts by the provisional government headed by revolutionary Alexander Kerensky, 1881–1970, to curb the Bolsheviks' influence. The only socialist member of the first provisional government, Kerensky's government proved ineffective and failed to meet the demands of the people. He also failed to end the country's involvement in World War I, which the Bolsheviks viewed as an imperialistic war. On November 7 the Bolsheviks led workers and disgruntled soldiers and sailors in a takeover of Petrograd's Winter Palace, the scene of Bloody Sunday in 1905, and which had become the headquarters of Kerensky's provisional government. By November 8 the provisional government had fallen.
What did the United States gain from the Mexican War?
The Mexican War, 1846–48, was officially ended when the U.S. Senate ratified the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on March 10, 1848. By the treaty, Mexico relinquished roughly half its territory, New Mexico and California, to the United States. Mexico also recognized the Rio Grande as its border with Texas. Mexico received payments in the millions from the United States, which also assumed the payment of claims of its citizens. 5 years later, under the terms of the Gadsden Purchase, the United States purchased a small portion of land from Mexico for another $10 million, which was widely regarded as further compensation for the land lost in the war. The territory the United States gained was in present-day Arizona and New Mexico, south of the Gila River.
What happened at Anzio?
Anzio, Italy, was the site of a 4-month battle between Allied troops and the Germans during World War II, 1939–45. On January 22, 1944, more than 36,000 Allied troops and thousands of vehicles made an amphibious landing at Anzio, which is situated on a peninsula jutting into the Tyrrhenian Sea. But German soldiers, led by Field Marshal Albert Kesserling, 1885 to 1960. Were able to surround the Allied forces, containing them along the shoreline into May of that year. Fighting was intense, with an estimated 60,000 casualties, about half on each side. On May 25, 1944, the Germans withdrew in defeat, enabling the Allies to march toward Rome, 33 miles to the north-northwest. The taking of Anzio was a tactical surprise on the part of the US and British, and their eventual victory there was a turning point for the Allies in the war.
Were all the battles of the American Revolution waged in the Northeast?
No, there was also fighting in the southern colonies. But the struggle between the American colonists and the British was further complicated in the South by the presence of slaves. Landowners feared that any fighting in the vicinity would inspire slaves to revolt against them. Knowing this, the British believed they could regain control of the southern colonies more readily than those in the north. In November 1775, the British governor of Virginia offered to free any slaves who would fight for the British. As many as 2,000 black slaves accepted the offer and took up arms. But there were also patriots in the South. It was Virginian Patrick Henry, 1736 to 1799, who uttered the famous words, "Give me liberty or give me death." In late February 1776, Patriot forces confronted and defeated pro-British colonists near Wilmington, North Carolina. The British troops who were sailing from Boston, Massachusetts, to North Carolina to join the loyal colonists arrived too late to help. They instead sailed on to Charleston, South Carolina, which was also the scene of fighting that summer.
What was the gunpowder plot?
In 1605, a group of 12 men, who believed the English government to be hostile to Roman Catholics, laid plans to blow up the Houses of Parliament with King James I, 1566 to 1625, and government officials in it. Their scheme was discovered, however, and all of the conspirators were put to death. The event is remembered today in two ways: on the night of November 4, which was when the plot was supposed to be carried out, the English hold a festival in which Guy Fawkes, 1570 to 1606, the conspirator who originated the gunpowder plot, is burned in effigy. Further, the vaults beneath the Houses of Parliament are searched before each new session.
Who was Dorothea Dix?
Dorothea Lindy Dix, 1802 to 1887. Was a philanthropist and among the first American women to become active in social reform. having been headmistress of her own school for girls in Boston from 1821 to 1836, in 1841 Dix toured Massachusetts state correctional institutions, where she was shocked to see deplorable treatment of the mentally ill. Thereafter Dix became an impassioned advocate for the mentally ill, leading a drive to build hospitals for the specialized care of those afflicted with mental illnesses. Dix appealed to the consciences of legislators and philanthropists. She was successful in establishing mental hospitals throughout the United States, Canada, and Europe, many of which still bear her name. Dix's campaign for humane treatment of the mentally ill transformed American attitudes and institutions in the 2 decades that led up to the Civil War, 1861 to 65. During the war she acted as superintendent of the U.S. Army nurses. She also worked to improve prison conditions during her lifetime.
When was the computer chip developed?
The computer chip, or integrated circuit, was developed in the late 1950s by 2 researchers who were working independently of each other: Jack Kilby, 1923, of Texas Instruments, who developed his chip in 1958, and by Robert Noyce, 1927 to 1990, of Fairchild Semiconductor, in 1959. The chip is an electronic device made of a very small piece, usually less than 1/4 inch square, of silicon wafer, and today has typically hundreds of thousands miniature transistors and other circuit components that are interconnected. Since its development in the late 1950s, the number of tiny components a chip can have has steadily risen, improving computer performance, since the chips perform a computer's control, logic, and memory functions. A computer's microprocessor is a single chip that holds all of the computer's logic and arithmetic. It is responsible for interpreting and executing instructions given by a computer program, software. The microprocessor can be thought of as the brain of the computer's operating system. Many other consumer electronic devices rely on the computer chip as well, including the microwave, the VCR, and calculators.
How old is chess?
It dates to the Middle Ages. In 1283 Alfonso X, 1221 to 1284, King of Castile and Leon, Spain, commissioned the Libro de Ajedrez, Dados y Tablas, Book of Chess, Dice, and Backgammon, based on an Arabic text. This book is still considered an important source on leisure activities in the Middle Ages. 500-1350.
Are the adventures of Marco Polo true?
Most of the tales are accepted as true and accurate by modern scholars. It is only those accounts that deal with places where it is not known that Marco Polo traveled, such as Africa, that are seen as legend rather than fact. Upon his return to Venice in 1295, Marco Polo, 1254–1324, took up the family occupation and worked as a merchant. 3 years later, he was on board a ship that was captured by a rival Genoese ship. He was subsequently imprisoned in the port city of Genoa, where he met a writer named Rustichello, or Rusticiano, from the Italian city of Pisa. Polo recounted his stories to Rustichello, who wrote them down and published them as the Diversament do Monde, Description of the World. The book was an immediate popular success and became one of the most important sources of Western knowledge of the East. Readers today know the stories as the travels of Marco Polo.
What was the Iran-Contra affair?
It was a series of actions on the part of U.S. federal government officials, which came to light in November 1986. The discoveries had the immediate effect of hurting President Ronald Reagan, 1911–2004, whose policy of anti-terrorism had been undermined by activities initiated from his own executive office. Following in-depth hearings and investigations into who knew what, when, Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh, 1912, submitted his report on January 18, 1994, stating that the dealings with Iran and with the Contra rebels in Nicaragua had violated United States policy and law. The tangled string of events involved Reagan's national security advisors Robert McFarlane, 1937, and Admiral John Poindexter, 1936, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, 1943. Poindexter's military aid, the Iranian government, and Nicaraguan rebels. The U.S. officials evidently had begun their dealings with both the Iranian government and the Nicaraguan rebels with the goal of freeing 7 Americans who were held hostage by Iranian-backed rebels in Lebanon. President Reagan had met with the families of the captives and was naturally concerned about the hostage situation. Under pressure to work to free the hostages, McFarlane, Poindexter, and North arranged to sell an estimated $30 million in spare parts and anti-aircraft missiles to Iran, then at war with neighboring Iraq. In return, the Iranian government would put pressure on the terrorist groups to release the Americans. Profits from the arms sale to Iran were then diverted by Lieutenant North to the Contras in Central America who were fighting the dictatorial Nicaraguan government. Congress had already passed laws that prohibited U.S. government aid to the Nicaraguan rebels. The diversion of funds certainly appeared to violate those laws. The Iran-Contra affair led to North's dismissal and to Poindexter's resignation. Both men were prosecuted, though the hostages were freed. Reagan's public image was seriously damaged by how the release had been achieved. During the Iran-Contra hearings in 1987, National Security Commission officials revealed that they had been willing to take the risk of providing arms to Iran in exchange for the safe release of the hostages, because they all remembered the US government's failed attempt in 1980 to rescue hostages held at the American embassy in Tehran, Iran. Nevertheless, the deal with Iran had supplied a hostile country with American arms that could then be used against the United States. In 1987, Iran did launch an offensive when it attacked Kuwaiti oil tankers that were registered as American and laid mines in the Persian Gulf. The United States responded by sending in the Navy, which attacked Iranian patrol boats. During this military initiative, the U.S. Navy accidentally shot down a civilian passenger jet, killing everyone on board.
Why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor?
There is still disagreement among historians, military scholars, and investigators about why the island nation of Japan issued this surprise attack on the U.S. military installation at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Some believe that Japan had been baited into making the attack in order to marshal public opinion behind U.S. entry into World War II, 1939-45. Others maintain that the United States was unprepared for such an assault, or at least, the Japanese believed Americans to be in a state of unreadiness. And still others theorize that Pearl Harbor was an all-or-nothing gamble on the part of Japan to knock America's Navy out of the war before it had even entered into the fray. These are the facts. In 1941, Japanese troops had moved into the southern part of Indochina, prompting the United States to cut off its exports to Japan. In fall of that year, as General Hideki Tojo, 1884-1948, became Prime Minister of Japan, the country's military leaders were laying plans to wage war on the United States. On December 7, Pearl Harbor, the hub of U.S. naval power in the Pacific, became the target of Japanese attacks, as did the American military bases at Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines. But it was the bombing of Pearl Harbor that became the rallying cry for Americans during the long days of World War II, since it was at this strategic naval station, which had been occupied under treaty by the U.S. military since 1908, that Americans had felt the impact of the conflict.
Who was the first to write a modern novel?
While there are differing opinions on the answer to this question, it is generally accepted that the credit for the novel as we know it belongs to Spanish writer Miguel de Cervantes, 1547-1616. Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, in two parts, 1605 and 1615. It was the first extended prose narrative in European literature in which characters and events are depicted in what came to be called the modern realistic tradition. Considered an epic masterpiece, Don Quixote had an undeniable influence on early novelists, including English novelist and playwright Henry Fielding, who wrote the realistic novel Tom Jones, 1749. Don Quixote is also said to have anticipated later fictional masterpieces, including French novelist Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, 1857, Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Idiot, 1868-69. And American writer Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, 1876, and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, 1884.
How did the earliest peoples arrive in North America?
Long before the arrival of the Europeans in the Western Hemisphere in the late 1400s and early 1500s. Asian peoples are believed to have migrated over Beringia, a land bridge that is thought to have existed over the Bering Strait, the waterway that separates Asia, Russia, from North America, Alaska. Scholars believe that during the Late Ice Age, known as the Pleistocene Glacial Epoch, which ended about 10,000 BC, a natural bridge was formed across the strait either by ice or by dropping sea levels that exposed land masses. Asian peoples, who were hunters, are believed to have migrated over Beringia as they pursued large game, arriving in North America as early as 50,000 BC. These people, called Paleo-Indians, were the first inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere. After their arrival, they spread out across North and South America. The many American Indian groups that were encountered by the Europeans upon their arrival were descendants of the migratory Paleo-Indians.
What is the Big Bang Theory?
It is a theory of the origin of the universe. According to the Big Bang Theory, the universe began as the result of an explosion that occurred between 15 and 20 billion years ago. Over time, the matter created in the Big Bang broke apart, forming galaxies, stars, and a group of planets we know as the Solar System. The theory was first put forth by Edwin Hubble, 1889 to 1953, who observed that the universe is expanding uniformly and objects that are greater distances are receding at greater velocities. In the 1960s, Bell Telephone Laboratories scientists discovered weak radio waves that are believed to be all that remains of the radiation from the original fireball. The discovery further supported Hubble's theory, which puts the age of the universe between 15 and 20 billion years. Astronomers have observed that the galaxies are still moving away from each other and that they'll probably continue to do so forever, or at least for about the next 70 billion years. If the galaxies did come together again, scientists believe that all of the matter in the universe would explode again. In other words, there would be another Big Bang, and the result would be consistent with that of the first. It would produce a universe much like the one people live in today. Another supporter of the Big Bang Theory is British theoretical scientist Stephen Hawking, 1942. In 1988 Hawking, who is known for his theories on black holes, gravitational forces in space, made by what were once stars, published his ideas in the best-selling book A Brief History of Time, From the Big Bang to Black Holes.
What is the incidence of conflict in Africa?
Since the end of World War II, 1939–45, there have been at least 56 separate identifiable conflicts in Africa, with about a dozen of them ongoing in 2005. The continent seemed to be in a state of turmoil, with conflicts ranging from regional skirmishes between warlords to civil war. The unimaginable horrors of the Rwandan genocide, 1994, the decades-old civil unrest and ethnic cleansing in Sudan, and long-standing rebel violence in Uganda made news the world over. The war-ravaged image of Africa caused many observers to wonder if the continent was unusually prone to civil war. In a study published by the World Bank, researchers concluded in 2000 that Africa has had a similar incidence of civil conflict to that of other developing regions, and that, with minor exceptions, its conflicts are consistent with the global pattern. The authors of that report acknowledged that the rising trend of conflict in Africa was due to its atypically poor economic performance. While many could see only Africa as war-torn, others pointed to the fact that most of Africa's nations were peaceful, and that the trouble spots gave the international community an overstated impression of despair on the continent.
How did the Civil War begin and end?
Unhappy with the outcome of the 1860 presidential election, in which Abraham Lincoln, 1809–1865, was elected, and fearing a loss of their agrarian way of life, the southern states began to make good on their promise to secede if Lincoln won the presidency. South Carolina was the first, in December of that year. In January 1861 5 more states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana. When representatives from the 6 states met the next month in Montgomery, Alabama, they established the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis, 1808–1889, president. 2 days before Lincoln's inauguration, Texas joined the Confederacy. Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee joined in April. Shortly after, the Civil War had already begun. The Civil War, also called the War of Secession and the War between the States, began on April 12, 1861, when Southern troops fired on Fort Sumter, a U.S. military post in Charleston, South Carolina. Brutal fighting continued for 4 years. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee, 1807–1870, surrendered his ragged Confederate troops to General Ulysses S. Grant, 1822–1885, of the Union at Old Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The war had not only been between the states. It had also been between brothers. The conflict divided the nation. The Civil War took more American lives than any other war in history.
How were the Gauls related to the Celts?
The ancient Gauls were a Celtic people who spoke forms of the Celtic language. They occupied the ancient country of Gaul, a region west of the Rhine River and north of the Pyrenees Mountains, an area that today consists of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, part of Germany, and part of the Netherlands. The Gauls were led by priests, who were called Druids. By 390 BC the Gauls had moved southward, across the Alps and into Italy. In the 3rd century BC, they battled the powerful Romans and were briefly successful. Ultimately, however, they were defeated, becoming subjects of Rome. Later, under Julius Caesar, the Romans conquered all of Gaul, so that by 50 BC the region became part of the Roman Empire. 5 centuries later, Gaul was overrun by the Franks, for whom the region was named. Thus, French people today are descendants of the Gauls. Also, the Galatians, one of the Christian peoples to whom the Apostle Paul wrote while he was in jail, were descendants of the Gauls who settled in Macedonia and Asia Minor, the peninsula between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, which today is occupied by Turkey.
Was Attila the Hun really a savage?
While Attila, c. 406 to 453, may have possessed some of the worthwhile qualities of a military leader, the king of the Huns was no doubt a ruthless and fierce figure. He is believed to have ascended through the ranks of the Hun army, coming to power as the leader of the nomadic group in 434. By this time, the Huns, who originated in Central Asia, had occupied the Volga River Valley in the area of present-day Western Russia. At first, like his predecessors, he was wholly occupied with fighting other barbarian tribes for control of lands. But under Attila's leadership, the Huns began to extend their power into Central Europe. He waged battles with the Eastern Roman armies, and, after murdering his older brother and co-ruler Balda in 445, went on to trample the countries of the Balkan Peninsula and northern Greece, causing terrible destruction along the way. As Attila continued westward with his bloody campaigns, which each Hun fought using his own weapons and his own savage technique, he nearly destroyed the foundations of Christianity. But the combined armies of the Romans and the Visigoths defeated Attila and the Huns at Chalons, in northeastern France, in June 451, which is known as one of the most decisive battles of all time. From there, Attila and his men moved into Italy, devastating the countryside before Pope Leo I, c. 400 to 461, succeeded in persuading the brutal leader to spare Rome. For this and other reasons, Leo was later canonized, becoming Saint Leo. Attila died suddenly and of natural causes in 453. Just as he was again preparing to cross the Alps and invade Italy anew.
Who invented the steam engine?
Like many other modern inventions, the steam engine had a long evolution. It was first conceived of by Greek scientist Hero of Alexandria in the 1st century AD. The mathematician invented many contrivances that were operated by water, steam, or compressed air. These included not only a fountain and a fire engine, but the steam engine. Many centuries later, Englishman Thomas Newcomen (1663 to 1729) developed an early steam engine, about 1711, that was used to pump water. He was improving on a previous design, which had been patented by another inventor in 1698. But it was Scottish inventor James Watt, 1736 to 1819, who substantially improved Newcomen's machine, patenting his own steam-powered engine in 1769. It was the first practical steam engine, and Watt's many improvements to the earlier technology paved the way for the use of the engine in manufacturing and transportation during the Industrial Revolution. C. 1750 1850, Britain was just on the cusp of this new age when Watt patented his engine. The steam engine was eventually replaced by more efficient devices such as the turbine. Developed in the 1800s, the electric motor, also developed in the 1800s, the internal combustion engine. First practical engine built in 1860, and the diesel engine, patented 1892. Nevertheless, James Watt's steam engine played a critical role in moving society from an agricultural to industrial-based economy. Watt's legacy also includes the use of horsepower and watts as units of measure.
Why does the music of Bartók figure prominently in concert programs today?
Béla Bartók, 1881 to 1945, is revered today not only for his ability as a pianist. His teacher compared him to Franz Liszt 1811 to 1886, who was perhaps the greatest pianist of the 19th century. But for his compositions, which are steeped in the tradition of Hungarian folk music. Bartók studied and analyzed Hungarian, Romanian, and Arabian folk tunes, publishing thousands of collections of them in his lifetime. While ethnic music had influenced the works of other composers, Bartók was the first to make it an integral part of art music composition. His works were unique in that the folk music provided the sheer essence and substance of the music, lending the compositions a primitive quality. Among his masterpieces are his three stage works, the ballets The Wooden Prince and The Miraculous Mandarin, and the one-act opera Duke Bluebeard's Castle. The introduction of folk music as the core of a musical composition has had far-reaching influence, which must have been felt by American composer Aaron Copland, 1900 to 1990, whose Appalachian Spring, 1944, features a simple shaker tune, front and center.
What was Custer's last stand?
The term refers to the defeat of General George A. Custer, 1839 to 1876, at the Battle of Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876. Custer had a national reputation as a Civil War general and Indian fighter in the West. And when he and his troops were outnumbered and badly beaten by the Sioux led by Sitting Bull, c. 1831 to 1890, just as the country was about to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the result was a stunning reversal in the national mood. Little Bighorn was part of a series of campaigns known collectively as the Sioux War. Several events led to the conflict that became Custer's last stand. The Sioux were non-treaty Indians, which means they had refused to accept the white-dictated limits on their territory. They were outraged at the repeated violation of their lands by the onrush of miners to new gold strikes in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Further, there had been 8 attacks by the Sioux on the Crow who were living on reservation land. Finally, Sitting Bull, the chief of the Hunkpapa band of Sioux, refused government demands that he and his people return to reservation lands. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to the government's military strategists, by spring 1876 Sitting Bull had been joined in his cause by other groups of Northern Plains tribes, including the Cheyenne led by Crazy Horse. C. 1842 to 1877. With the government ready to use force to return Sitting Bull and his band of Sioux to reservations, the stage was set for a conflict bigger than any Washington official had imagined. On June 25 Custer rode into Montana Territory with his 7th Cavalry to meet the Sioux. Despite orders to simply contain the Indians and prevent their escape, he attacked. While historians remain divided on how Custer could have been defeated on that fateful June day, one thing remains certain: Custer and his men were badly outnumbered. Having divided his regiment into 3 parts, Custer rode with about 225 men against a force of at least 2,000, the largest gathering of Indian warriors in Western history. Custer and his soldiers all died. The fighting continued into the next day, with those Indians that remained finally disbanding and returning to their designated territory. Meantime, Sitting Bull and his band retreated into Canada. Returning to the United States 5 years later, in 1890, Sitting Bull was killed by authorities. The battle became the subject of countless movies, books, and songs. It's remembered by some Native Americans as a galvanizing Force proof that brave men who fight for what they believe in can win.
What happened after the 1993 World Trade Center bombing?
During the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, investigation that followed the February 26, 1993, tragedy, it was learned that the World Trade Center was one of several intended targets of an Islamic extremist group. The bomb explosion in Lower Manhattan killed 6 people and started a fire that sent black smoke through the 110-story Twin Towers, injuring hundreds and forcing 100,000 people to evacuate the premises. Days later, on March 4, 25-year-old Mohammed A. Salameh, an illegal Jordanian immigrant, was arrested in Jersey City, New Jersey. Salameh was later found to be a follower of self-exiled Islamic fundamentalist leader Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman. 1933, who was wanted by Egypt for having incited anti-government riots in 1989. In June, investigators seized Arab terrorists they accused of plotting to blow up several New York City sites, including the United Nations headquarters and the Holland and Lincoln tunnels. U.S. authorities then arrested Rahman and imprisoned him on suspicion of complicity in the World Trade Center bombing. On October 1, 1995, a federal jury found Rahman and 9 other militant Muslims guilty of conspiring to carry out a campaign of terrorist bombings and assassinations aimed at forcing Washington to abandon its support of Israel and Egypt. The 1993 bombing foreshadowed the terrorist strikes of September 11, 2001. Which destroyed the landmark Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan and launched what came to be called a global war on terrorism.
What were the rights of man?
In 1789 the French Assembly made the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, meant to flesh out the revolutionary cry of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Influenced by the U.S. Declaration of Independence, 1776, as well as the ideas of the Enlightenment. The document guaranteed religious freedom, the freedom of speech and the press, and personal security. It proclaimed that man has natural and inalienable rights, which include liberty, property, personal security, and resistance to oppression. The Declaration further stipulated that no one may be accused, imprisoned, or held under arrest except in such cases and in such a way as is prescribed by law, and that every man is presumed innocent until he is proved guilty. The Declaration was subsequently written into the preamble of the French Constitution, 1791. However, the Code Napoleon superseded many of the ideas it set forth.